It's what is it today? The 27th of March. In the last few days, there's been an announcement by the United Kingdom's Space Agency about opening a new office in Glasgow. So I'd like to look back a little bit at the history of the British space industry, the space programme itself, and what this new development might mean for Scotland's own infant space industry and space programme. Now, you're probably aware that Sir Richard Branson, the famous British record and airline billionaire, had launched a company about, I think it was about 18 months ago. They attempted to launch an object into space using a system which they termed they termed it Virgin Orbital. Now, this is, I suppose, a typical British attempt at a cheapo space programme, where Sir Richard Branson's company repurposed one of its aging fleet of transatlantic 747 aircraft to drop a rocket from under its wing at high altitude, which is then was meant to light off its rockets and take a payload into orbit. Now, this failed, unfortunately, due to a problem with the rocket itself. But the interesting thing about this was that the British Space Agency, the UK Space Agency, pumped a lot of money into what we would call a horizontal spaceport in Cornwall, which had a long enough runway for this large jumbo jet to take off from, and where there was an open piece of ocean nearby over which this rocket could fly safely without parts of it dropping on populated areas. So it seemed like a great idea at the time, and as I've said, the British space programme put a large amount of money into this horizontal spaceport in Cornwall. So Richard Branson's effort failed, I think, largely because typical British sort of space entrepreneurship is you have one go at it, and if you fail, well, that's the end of that. And so there didn't seem to be any plan for a second launch, and almost as soon as that rocket failed, Richard Branson's company, Virgin Orbital, was wound up. It basically went bankrupt, and that was the end of the British space programme in Cornwall, sadly. Now, I know there are other launcher companies wanting to use this spaceport in Cornwall for other forms of horizontal launching, and that will probably happen in the future. But what about Scotland? Well, Scotland is unique in the United Kingdom in that it has two rocket building companies, one based in Forres, that is Orbex, and the other based in Edinburgh, and that is called Skyrora. Both of these companies are manufacturing small scale vertically launched rockets, typical of the type that you would have seen back in the 60s, I suppose, launching from Cape Canaveral. Multi-stage rockets designed to take satellites into what are known as sun-synchronous orbits, where the launch aperture, in other words, the direction that they fly, takes them northwards over the top of the world, if you like, over the North Pole, and then down over the South Pole. So they go into an orbit which is basically in the sort of 90 degrees to what you would normally expect. And these are very useful for Earth observation satellites, and also, interestingly, for spy satellites. So we have these two firms getting ready to launch. The latest word I have from them was that they are preparing to launch from a Scottish launch site in around 2026. Now, this news, if I remember correctly, came from Orbex, the company in Forres. Both the companies, both Orbex and Skyrora, are essentially Scottish, but they have links to former Eastern European, or former Soviet countries, in fact, including Ukraine. And so both these companies have links with Eastern Europe in some way or other, but there is a great deal of technical expertise available in both of these countries, particularly in rocketry and the technology required to reach orbit. So Scotland has two launcher companies preparing to launch their own rockets, and they are both unique, incidentally. One uses a form of biopropane as a fuel, which is distilled from waste plastic, as far as I understand it. That is the Orbex rocket. No, beg your pardon. No, just getting confused there. No, they are using biopropane, that is true, but I'm not sure what they're distilling it from, but it is a waste product that is being used for it. Skyrora also distills its rocket fuel from waste plastic cups. So again, it's pretty green. It's also using an oxidizer, that is the part of the fuel system which provides the oxygen so the rocket can burn in space. And their oxidizer is hydrogen peroxide, or HTP, high test peroxide, which is a potent form of peroxide, the kind of thing that people used in hair salons. But hydrogen peroxide, interestingly, if you pass this gas through a silver mesh, it immediately breaks down and starts to decompose. That means it suddenly becomes steam at incredibly high temperatures and pressures. That alone produces a lot of thrust, but because it's so high temperature, if you introduce fuel into that, then you have a very potent rocket which can be turned on and off, and the fuel is at room temperature, which means that you can truck it around in trucks, and you don't have to keep it super cold as you do with most liquid cryogenic propellants. So Scotland has this technology ready to go, both in the form of Orbex's unusual rocket and Skyroar's as well. The problem at the moment is launching. The only launch site which is, I think, at the moment ready to go is at Saxford in Shetland. Now, this is interesting because this is another indigenous project, self-funding, self-starting, local businesses put together a bid, got hold of the land, developed it into a launch pad, are building the facilities at their own expense. And as far as I can understand, they're getting very little help from the United Kingdom Space Agency, which brings me back to the latest news. Now, why on earth would the United Kingdom suddenly decide to open offices in both Wales and Scotland for its space agency? Well, my conjecture is this, that the United Kingdom's initial attempts at a space program through Sir Richard Branson, who I suppose is their British equivalent of Elon Musk, but sadly his attempt suffered from that British disease, which is we don't want to take any risks, so we'll just fund one attempt at it, and if that goes wrong, we're just going to stop. And that is exactly what happened. And that leaves the United Kingdom Space Agency with a rather embarrassing conundrum. How do they support the Scottish space programme and make it seem as if it's a British space programme? And I think the obvious answer to that is to open an office for the UK Space Agency in Edinburgh. In that way, they can, I suppose, start to involve themselves in the Scottish Indigenous Space Programme and start to stamp the Union flag over it. Now, there are plans for the United Kingdom Space Agency to build its own launch complex, and that is already underway in Sutherland in northwest Scotland. They purchased a site which is basically a peat bog on some high terrain, which has an open launch azimuth, again, over the open water, with nothing in the way of landmass or population centres for spent rocket stages to fall on. But as far as I understand it, that particular launch site is not anything like as ready as the one in Saxford. So, as I said, my guess is that the British government has realised, after the embarrassment of the Virgin Orbital attempt at Cornwall, that they need to somehow present the United Kingdom Space Agency as something which is more than just based in England, and therefore they're opening these offices in both Scotland and in Cardiff in Wales as well, to try to show that this is a UK-wide effort and they are pumping money into the Scottish space programme. So far, I've not been able to locate any information on whether or not the United Kingdom Space Agency is providing any funding to the Scottish space race, as it were. And remember, there is a space race, because both of these launcher businesses, both Skyroar and Orbex, are competing to be the first Scottish firm to launch a Scottish rocket from a Scottish launch site. And that would be an amazing first for Scotland. The reason why the British state, I think, is so keen to rebadge the Scottish space programme as British is that basically, I suppose, big companies, big countries, big not multinational, but you know what I mean, big superpowers like the United States and Russia and China, India, they all have a space programme, and it's a badge of honour. I mean, it is basically, I suppose, the ultimate status symbol to have your own space programme, and it kind of shows you in a more favourable light. It makes your your country look a lot more successful, a lot more important on the world stage. And that kind of kudos is something that the United Kingdom has lacked. And the embarrassment of the failure of the Virgin Orbital effort a few months ago has obviously put a dent in that plan. So now they're transferring their attentions to the Scottish space sector, which, as we know, Scotland possesses the largest and most numerous satellite manufacturing facility anywhere in Europe. Hundreds of satellites are built in Scotland every single year. Small, sophisticated satellites, just the type which are perfect to go up on these smaller polar-launched rockets which we've been talking about. So it's beginning to look as if the United Kingdom is attempting yet another one of these British takeovers of a Scottish industry in an effort to try to make itself look as though it is actually the one doing the work. When in actual fact, it appears at the moment at least that there isn't very much funding coming from the United Kingdom Space Agency, despite the fact that both Orbex and Skyrover are rather obliged to put a Union Jack on their rockets and claim that they are United Kingdom companies, which technically they are, except that they're entirely based in Scotland, and they have thousands of Scottish workers. They also have thousands of workers in Eastern Europe, and they combine to produce these two remarkable new launch systems. So in around, I think, the Scottish baby space program has largely been ignored because the English government, and I'm saying that very deliberately, wanted to focus very much more on the likes of Sir Richard Branson, their very own Elon Musk. And if he'd succeeded in getting a rocket launched from underneath the wing of this ancient airliner and got it to orbit, that would have been a major feather in the cap of the United Kingdom. The very first satellite launched by a British launcher from British soil, waving the old Union flag. But now that's a distant memory. And now we have two Scottish companies vying with each other to be the first to launch a satellite over the poles. Anyway, that's about it from Inde-Car today, but I thought you might find it interesting to know that our space programme, like everything else in Scotland, is coveted by the British government because it's so successful and because it's self-started. It didn't really get into the whole business of looking for big funding from the United Kingdom Space Agency. It just did it itself. Good old bootstrapping, you might say. And that is the hallmark of Scottish innovation and has been for decades, just simply because we don't get any funding from the United Kingdom most of the time. Okay, that's it from today's Inde-Car on YouTube. Share this and set your notifications if you haven't already. And I look forward to making another program for you later on this week and possibly into the weekend as well. But as I always say, keep the faith. Independence will be along sometime soon, and we'll be able to take charge of our own space program, and it will be Scotland's space program. Bye for now.